First You Think is a not-for-profit ministry of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. Support us at ucdsm.org today.
Morning. I'm Bill Brauch. My pronouns are he, his. Our fourth UU principle goes to the heart of what it means to be Unitarian Universalist, the right to engage in a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The UUA's website includes an insightful reflection about this principle by the Reverend Paige Getty of the UU Congregation of Columbia, Maryland. She wrote, "As responsible religious seekers, we recognize that we are privileged to be free, to have resources to pursue life beyond mere survival, to continually search for truth and meaning, to exist beyond bonds of dogma and oppression, and to wrestle freely with truth and meaning as they evolve." Now, maybe like me, you don't spend your days contemplating existential questions such as, how did this universe arise? Why are we here? What are we to do to live a good life? What leads to true happiness? Such questions do not often jut to the forefront of conscious thought, but I know they color so much of my existence as I make my way through this life. For example, when I'm faced with a major decision, I try to determine the right thing to do. That right thing for which I'm searching absolutely arises from a moral compass that's guided by my personal search for truth and meaning. Now, when I was little, I didn't have far to search. My parents told me all they thought I needed to know about why we exist and what we are to do in this world. They came to it through the lens of Christian fundamentalism. They attended the aptly named Bible Church in Waukesha, Wisconsin. The chief tenet of the church is that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God, as communicated through his human vessels on earth. The message there, back in the early 60s, was clear. There is only one God, and there is only one true faith. The goal of life is to seek everlasting life in heaven, and the only way to accomplish that is to ask Jesus into your heart, by which you are born again, and also to recruit others to the faith. Of course, there were also a lot of thou shalt nots, including swearing, drinking, dancing, and coveting stuff you shouldn't covet, etc. A side note, my mom really preferred the Assembly of God Church, a charismatic Pentecostal congregation her parents attended, where folks sometimes spoke out in tongues. The few times Mom took me there, hearing folks shouting out unintelligible words of praise scared me. Now, that congregation eventually got bigger and moved to a bigger location, and for a time after, the church building was the town community theater. Today, the site of that church is the home of, wait for it, the United Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Waukesha. I've been there. Nice folks. Back to the Bible Church. I generally enjoyed it there. A couple of grade school friends were there in my Sunday school classes. Dad drove the Sunday school bus, picking up kids here and there around town. I rode along. It was a good time with Dad, who, if you heard my reflection earlier this year, you know that he was disabled with serious depression. But he was able to function well in some aspects of life. Now, regarding Sunday school, I definitely did not buy everything they were selling, but it did make me think more about how this universe came to be. I did my best to be a good Sunday school student and to sit quietly with Mom and Dad during the service. But after I turned 12, things fell apart. First, an older cousin with whom I was close died in a motorcycle accident. Then our beloved dog died. Brownie was in the family before I was born, and he was my confidant. I would look into his beautiful face and tell him about my day. I really missed him. Then Dad started talking openly of suicide, to the point where Mom called her brother, my Uncle Bob, over to remove Dad's hunting rifles from the house. Dad was then hospitalized for some time. At the end of this came the transition to middle school. I was so hurt and confused by life that this big change was just one too many. Day after day, I'd go to school, I'd feel a pain in my stomach the first hour or so, and go to the school nurse. They'd call Dad, who was now back home as the stay-at-home parent, and he'd come to take me home. Over and over it went until I just stopped going. This was the beginning of a recurring problem with generalized anxiety disorder that has affected me on or off for most of my life since. My parents, distracted and distraught by their own problems, didn't know what to do. One day I learned that my Sunday school teacher told his class, I wasn't there that day, he told them that what I was doing and not going to school was wrong, and that the students should not be like Billy. This guy was our optometrist. Dad made him call and apologize to me, and he did, but the damage was done. From that point forward, there was no chance I was going back to that church. It turned out that even church was not a safe place. And that was that for me in Christian fundamentalism. Now, someday I may tell you how I emerged from all this to go on to do well in school, college, and law school, but that's a story for another day. Throughout my teens, I never lost the sense of wonder about creation and the meaning of our existence. In my late teens, I read a magazine article about Seals and Crofts, the pop folk duo. The story focused on their devotion to the Baha'i faith. The basic tenets of Baha'i are that all religions and people are essentially worthy, and that its adherents should strive for the elimination of racial, class, and religious prejudices. That sounded much more like the worldview of life that I was developing. I checked out a book from the public library about Baha'i. And while the basic tenets were attractive, some of the other aspects of it were not a good match for me, and I lost interest in pursuing it further. A number of years later, my next brush with religion was in the mid-1980s when I was at the University of Iowa College of Law and met the love of my life, Karen. She attended Sunday services held by the University Episcopal chaplain, Ron Osborne. My first time attending, Iowa Episcopal Bishop Walter Reiter gave the sermon. His focus that day was the farm crisis and its impact on rural Iowans. His basic message was that it needn't have happened but for the greed of big agriculture. Reiter's sermon really resonated with me, and the sermons in the weeks following from Reverend Osborne were even more in line with my worldview. During the Iran-Contra affair, for example, of the Reagan administration, Ron would open prayers every week by asking that the government finally tell us the truth about what they were doing. This was a revelation to me in my search for truth and meaning. Hey, church can be a place where we name injustice and demand it end. Now, after law school, Karen and I moved to Des Moines for employment, and on Ron's recommendation, began attending one of the local Episcopal churches. We continued to appreciate the liberal nature of the message and the tradition of the service, heralding back to the Anglican Church. It was comforting to repeat the same ancient mantras, albeit in modern language, week after week. We both joined the choir. I joined the Human Needs Committee, and over time, we both joined the church governing board. It was during this time that I learned about Thomas Jefferson's revision of the New Testament. His purpose in drafting it was to focus on what he viewed as the heart of the faith, the purported actual words of Jesus. Jefferson didn't write it to be published, but for his own devotional use. It begins with an account of Jesus' birth, but deletes all references to angels, genealogy, prophecy, miracles, the Trinity, the divinity of Jesus, and Jesus' resurrection. Now, I chose the chapter today featuring the Beatitudes, as I have always found them the most beautiful statement of the values that any faith community, indeed any person, should espouse. Here, Jesus is purported to have highlighted certain favored human qualities, including peacemaking and being meek, merciful, and pure. They are clearly meant to give hope to folks when times are tough, when they mourn a loss, when they are poor in spirit, which could be because they are simply poor and have lost hope. To me, the Beatitudes are the heart of the Christian faith. They are a description of the golden rule in practice. It is a part of the faith that I will always treasure. Being an Episcopalian was a wonderful experience, but about 25 years after joining, it became clear that the faith was no longer a good fit for where the three of us, now including our budding young scientist, Rachel, were in our individual searches for truth and meaning. For me, repeating rote statements of faith to which I no longer fully ascribed every Sunday felt hypocritical. I longed for a faith home with a liberal message that recognized and valued the beliefs of its members, whatever they happened to be. I found that here. Karen and I agreed that I would act as religious scout, attending a couple of churches, including this church, while she continued at St. Andrews. I would then report back. My first time here was in July 2015. 3 things stood out. The 7 principles seemed a perfect fit for us. Second, Mark Stringer's sermons were a no-holds-barred religious liberalism that really hit home. And third, a presentation by guest speakers seemed timed just to attract us. They were the wife-husband team of Connie Barlow and Michael Dowd. They talked about their philosophy, meshing science and religion. A Nobel Prize winner described Dowd's book, Thank God for Evolution, being written by, quote, someone who understands that all of reality is sacred and science is our method of comprehending it, end quote. We figured if this church wants to promote these speakers, it's the place for us. As many say when they discover Unitarian Universalism, hey, I've been a UU for years, I just didn't know it. Add me to that crowd. I want to return for a moment to the UUA piece by Reverend Paige Getty about the 4th principle that I quoted earlier. She also wrote, this privilege to freely search for truth and meaning calls us not to be isolated and self-centered, believing that our single perspective trumps all others, but rather to be humble, to be open to the great mysteries of truth and meaning that life offers. And those mysteries may speak to us through our own intuition and experience, but also through tradition, community, conflict, nature, and relationships. Now, some of us may have moved away from the organized Christian faith or another organized faith, but that does not imply that we think we know better. Rather, we simply strive to be free, to pursue our own religious journey, free of external constraints. Now, regarding Frost's famous poem, I know there's much more to it, but what first meets the eye is the notion that nonconformity can be a very good thing. My take on it is that having the freedom to choose is what makes the difference. We are faced with some pretty difficult choices in life. Whom to marry or to marry at all, whether to have children, whether to take this job or another, where to live. Add to that list determining what your faith is, if any, and how and where to practice it. These are all heady decisions and are affected by circumstance, such as income and other factors. But choosing to be a nonconformist for nonconformity's sake in making them could turn out really bad. Going against the flow may have downsides, but it's a choice we can freely make. And it may lead to revelations and experiences that one would not have experienced, but for going down the untrodden path. I think the key is knowing yourself and being true to yourself. Now, the older I get, the more I hurt when I get up after sitting down for a while. But I also know myself better at this age, I think. In my search for truth and meaning, after 60 years with the organized Christian faith, I decided to go down a different path. But down that path, I found I can still love what I valued about Christianity while continuing to grow in my faith journey. And that has, indeed, made all the difference.